numbers trying to get through. An ominous task, packed car after packed car, kilometer after kilometer. Kosovar Albanians have been waiting, desperate to put behind them the horror that drove them from their home. Some have been here for days, some even for weeks. It took Valon Budima and his family 6 trying days to cross the border.
It is a very difficult situation behind the Serbian border. There is no food, there is no water, people are starving.
Adding to the tragedy, there is literally tons of aid sitting in Macedonia, but it can't reach those who need it most. Aid workers are not allowed past the Yugoslav border. At this border crossing alone, the line goes back more than 30 kilometers inside Kosovo. Humanitarian efforts are already stretched to the limit. And with thousands of refugees arriving every day, the crisis just keeps getting worse. This man finally made it into Macedonia after a week. He was only let through because his children are very ill. He says he'll never forgive the Serbs for what they've done to his family and to his people. They're starting to die on the other side of the border, he says. Newborn babies had nothing to eat for days. How could they do this to us? Valbona Kita has been a volunteer worker since she managed to get out. Now she dreams of only one thing.
I don't want to stay here. I want my home and my place. And everyone here wants that, nothing else. We want our country. Kosovo is our country. Not the Serbians. It's our Albanian country.
But for many refugees, it's a dream that will never be realized. They fled in an attempt to save their lives. Instead, at a makeshift cemetery near the border, dozens are now buried. People who died of exhaustion and disease in their search for a safe haven. Céline Galipo, CBC News, Iașinse, Macedonia.
The ethnic Albanian refugees are getting a far warmer welcome in Albania. But that country is overwhelmed too, and so are the refugees by what they've seen and what they've survived. Dawn Murray has that story.
Seen from Albania, Kosovo continues to burn and bleed. Just hours after the offer of a unilateral ceasefire by the Yugoslav government, Serb forces torched 2 villages in Kosovo, just kilometers from the Albanian border. A rooted people is being brutally transformed into a nation of refugees, pouring into Albania at the rate of 1,000 an hour. In the makeshift camps and hospitals, there were tales today of martyrdom and extermination, tales which can't be independently verified. Gani Bushati told of the extermination of his village, Ibanez, when Serb forces arrived on April 2nd. His own bullet wounds testified to his miraculous escape. They were executing us, he says. They were shooting at us with guns and shotguns, and we were lucky because we were the first to fall. The others fell on us. 150 villagers were slaughtered this way, he said. He and 3 others survived and escaped with the help of Kosovo Liberation Army rebels. In the Italian camp of Morini, children with deep shrapnel wounds carry even deeper psychological scars. Children like Dren Tsaka.
His family was killed one by one, and he has a gun in his farm, and his farm is broken, exploded.
As humanitarian aid and aid workers begin to pour into Albania, the OSCE, the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, has set up a coordination team. A team led by Canadian General Michel Maisonneuve, who spent 5 months as part of the OSCE verification mission in Kosovo.
We've tried to prop up the government of Albania by giving them a communications facility and coordination facility. So I've spread teams out to each one of the 12 prefects of Albania, and they're providing help to the government, targeting refugees, finding out where the aid is required, and helping them manage the problem.
Unlike Macedonia, Albania says it will accept, care for, and keep all the Kosovo refugees here until they can return to their homeland. It's a heroic task for a tiny nation, which is the poorest in Europe. Dawn Murray, CBC News, Tirana.
There were plenty of questions today about the refugees heading for this country. Some 5,000 of them could begin arriving this weekend, and many Canadians have been wondering just what to expect. Eric Sorensen tonight with some answers.
Ottawa calls it a work in progress. Days before a mass migration of refugees to Canada begins, the hastily conceived plan to evacuate is still being put together. Immigration officials are on their way to the border camps in Macedonia to oversee the selection of Kosovars by the UN High Commission on Refugees. Canada insists the refugees will be taken on a voluntary basis only, and Canada will do all it can to keep families together. The new arrivals must be medically fit to travel. At the same time, the vulnerable, like the very old and the very young, will get special consideration. Finally, refugees with family links in Canada stand a better chance of being chosen.
These people want to be in a safe haven. They want to have a shelter. They want to have food, clothes. They want to feel that their kids are secure.
But while there was unanimous approval among the federal parties for the bombing campaign, there's a clear split on the question of refugees.
Having 5,000 refugees come to Canada causes some problems.
The Reform Party would have preferred that Canada help the Kosovars closer to home.
A more reasonable process would be to put resources into providing shelter, food, water, and medical aid to the camps just outside of Kosovo.
The NDP says Canada should take in at least twice as many refugees as promised.
We have a moral obligation to do all we can, seeing as we're taking part in the military intervention.
The government says it doesn't rule out taking in more refugees if asked. Meantime, foreign affairs officials dismiss suggestions that NATO countries accepting refugees is exactly what Yugoslavia wants to complete its ethnic cleansing of Kosovo.
I don't think the international community has any intention of allowing Mr. Milosevic to win out on the campaign of ethnic cleansing.
Immigration Minister Lucien Robillard insists the refugees will want to go home eventually. But although they'll only be here on a ministerial permit, Robillard says once they set foot on Canadian soil, they'll be entitled to claim refugee status. And as far as she's concerned, the people who've been driven out of Kosovo are refugees. Eric Sorensen, CBC News, Ottawa.
I need more blankets.
Across the country, beds are being made, army barracks transformed, all part of an unprecedented relief effort for Canada on a handful of military bases where people usually train for battle. They're now preparing to house the battle-weary.
It's not going to be comfortable, but they will have heat, they will have food, and we will provide a certain level of medical care.
The refugees will arrive at CFB Trenton. They'll be met by immigration officials and then sent on to other bases across eastern Canada. Some might meet this woman. Janine Blanc rushed to the base as soon as she heard the news, one of dozens of local people who want to help. She's compelled by compassion and her own personal history.
I have been, myself, a prisoner of war in 1942 to 1945. And I know what those people are going through. So it just breaks my heart. I had to come.
This relief mission is already moving beyond the country's military bases into communities, even homes. Canadians trying to find some way to bring some peace to the victims of war.
Can make this one available very
Canadians like the Dale family in Aurora, Ontario. They're prepared to open their home to Kosovo's refugees.
I'm willing to share. I don't see how we cannot. How can we turn these people away? I mean, they've seen such hardship.
But many in the Albanian community worry that Canadian generosity might become a weapon in Milosevic's war.
It's very hard for us to say, do not help them. But people need help, and we have to do something. But it's not the appropriate way.
Canadian churches say the need is more important than the politics.
We want to send a message that we are out there to protect the lives of people, and we will take any action to protect the lives of people.
That is the military message as well, as the Canadian forces prepare to turn their bases into instant refugee camps, a sight this country has never witnessed before. Susan Bonner, CBC News, CFB Trenton.
Now to the military front. Tonight, NATO bombed a Yugoslav chemical factory, and there were blasts reported inside Belgrade once again. A forceful answer to the ceasefire declaration of Slobodan Milosevic. The CBC's David Holton has more on that and the day's other developments.
It's been the most intense 24 hours of bombing since the air war began. More missiles launched from U.S. warships in the Adriatic. more waves of air attacks from Aviano, Italy. In Belgrade, as thousands rallied to protest the bombing, Serb officials announced that President Milosevic has declared a ceasefire.
The government of Federal Republic of Yugoslavia and the Republic of Serbia have decided today to declare unilateral ceasefire against Albanian terrorists in Kosovo starting this night 8 o'clock.
But Milosevic's offer was quickly dismissed as a sham in NATO capitals.
I think that that this offer may be one sign that he's rattled, but we're going to continue to rattle him until he makes an offer that meets our conditions, and he's far away from that right now.
Far away, said President Clinton, because Milosevic must first agree to end the ethnic cleansing in Kosovo.
And Mr. Milosevic could end it now by withdrawing his military, police, and paramilitary forces, by accepting the deployment of an international security force.
Until then, NATO officials say the bombing will escalate.
I can show you cockpit video of one of yesterday's attacks. A very successful strike on an ammunition storage area.
There were the usual video clips about the latest bombings and claims of a solid NATO success rate.
Watch for 4 bombs coming in from the left of the screen.
Pentagon officials said attacks last night hit a wide range of targets: fuel depots, bridges, roads, and military barracks in both Serbia and Kosovo. But it was also conceded that even with better weather conditions, NATO is finding it hard to hit Serb troops and tanks in Kosovo.
It's clear that this army is good at using cover, concealment, and deception.
The Pentagon also acknowledged a deadly mistake, that at least one NATO missile hit a residential area last night in the Serb town of Aleksinac. Serb TV showed a whole street in ruins and claimed that 12 civilians were killed and dozens injured. Everything turned into chaos, said this man. British correspondent Tom Walker visited the site later and confirmed that NATO had made a major blunder.
It was a grisly scene. There were bits of body scattered all around the debris. There was one leg sticking out with a sock on it. It really were shocking scenes, and these were most definitely civilian areas.
This is a campaign of sheer terror against the population.
In Toronto, a group of prominent Canadians denounced the NATO attacks.
We're bombing everything in that country. There are no more military targets to be bombed. They were all bombed in the first few days.
But far from having any second thoughts about the air war, Pentagon officials say the bombing campaign will be stepped up. Already, there are reports of major strikes tonight on Serb targets, one of them on a key military airport just north of Belgrade. David Halton, CBC News, Washington.
Still ahead in tonight's news. Protesters storm the Manitoba legislature. And a record snowfall shuts down St. John's.
And later on the magazine.
A protest, complete with riot police and pepper spray. Native groups used the opening day of the spring session to hold an anti-government rally. And as Red Sharon reports, things got out of hand.
This is our legislature too, and we want to be seen and we want to be heard.
It was a protest driven by anger. Anger directed at a government Native leaders say does little to help with education or high unemployment. The crowd of about 500 crashed through the barricades and stormed the front doors. They were met by at least 70 riot police, who started hauling people out of the crowd and arresting them. At least one woman was injured in the crush.
Take her out. I got roughed up coming into the building.
Grand Chief Bill Travers managed to break through.
But I had no choice. I have to come in here. We have to say what has to be said. You know, somehow the Filmon government has to hear us, has to listen.
Pepper spray will be deployed against you.
I feel that wind coming in. It's going to blow right in, I know.
Just behind the riot police, with people coughing and the air filled with pepper spray, Lieutenant Governor Peter Leba arrived to inspect the honor guard. Justice Minister Vic Taves said he came in a back door and was unaware of the protesters.
I don't know. That's a security issue. I don't deal with that.
And with that, Gary Filmon opened the House for the first time in 280 days. after he said his government has been meeting recently with Native leaders to discuss their concerns, so the protest was a surprise.
Quite honestly, we were taken aback by the fact that they seemed to feel that was necessary to have yet another protest on the steps of the legislature.
Native leaders say there are more surprises ahead. Red Sharon, CBC News, Winnipeg.
Well, snowstorms in April aren't that unusual, but the one that hit the St. John's area overnight sure was. Meteorologists are calling it a freak spring blizzard, one that dumped a record 79 centimeters of snow. The city was paralyzed for hours, with schools and businesses closed, power lines down, and planes grounded at the airport. Gusting winds created 2-meter-high snowdrifts, but it's not going to last long. Mild weather is on the way. 2 French sailors are safe in Canada tonight after their yacht capsized in the North Atlantic. It happened in very rough seas off Sable Island. A passing freighter answered their distress call, but it couldn't do anything in the 3-story waves. After a few harrowing hours, a U.S. Coast Guard helicopter came to their rescue. Divers were dropped into the water and the stranded sailors were hoisted to safety. The 2 Frenchmen were flown to Halifax and are in good condition tonight. Next in tonight's news. The Prime Minister has kept a low profile during the Kosovo crisis. Is that about to change? He decided to shorten a trip to Latin America later this week, and he's called a special cabinet meeting for tomorrow. Our chief political correspondent, Jason Moskowitz, with more now on the Prime Minister and how he's handling the crisis.
Jean Chrétien is still smarting from the criticism that a family holiday kept him away from King Hussein's funeral. As the Prime Minister arrived back from Florida this evening, his office went out of its way to emphasize this was no holiday. He was visiting his 9-year-old granddaughter who had just left intensive care after being thrown from a horse. In the morning, Chrétien will hold the first special cabinet meeting with those ministers directly involved since the bombing began 2 weeks ago. And he will be back in the Commons next Monday when Parliament resumes, instead of making an official visit to Central America next week. Parliament Hill has been in recess for the last 2 weeks. Last week, some opposition parties asked that Parliament be recalled. Historian and author Michael Bliss agrees Chrétien had an obligation to do just that.
If Parliament doesn't meet at a time when the country is in fact going to war, making war on a sovereign country, what the hell is Parliament for?
On a daily basis, the Defense Minister and the Foreign Affairs Minister have talked about the Kosovo conflict, but the Prime Minister has picked his spots, speaking out on Kosovo while attending other public events. It is very much the Chrétien style to let his ministers speak for themselves, but military historian David Berkison believes so far the Prime Minister has not said nearly enough.
The government has decided on a policy. I think it's a good policy. I support it 100%. I think the government has got a responsibility to go out and sell it to the voters, and I think the Prime Minister's got to be the chief salesman.
During the Gulf War in 1991, Brian Mulrooney was everywhere. At the Royal Military College one day, at National Defense Headquarters the next.
This is where you put it all together, eh?
It is this high-profile style Jean Chrétien tries hard to avoid. But the critics say, in a time of crisis, leaders have to be the first out of the gate.
I understand that Mr. Chrétien may want to take a low-profile role, partly, I think, because they hope it'll be a low-profile war that will end and all be gone and forgotten about, but it's clearly not.
Advisors say although the Prime Minister has not spent a lot of time in front of television cameras, he has been talking to world leaders on the telephone and that he gets full briefings on a daily basis. But they've decided that's not enough. And beginning with tomorrow's special cabinet meeting, the Prime Minister will take on a higher profile. Jason Moskowitz, CBC News, Ottawa.
Now, here's Brian Stewart with our magazine.
Good evening. The stories they tell are terrible, of forced marches, of mass murder, and of unspeakable atrocities. Tonight, what the refugees fleeing Kosovo are saying and how the West should respond. Fred Abrams is with Human Rights Watch and is responsible for their Kosovo file. He joins us from New York. And from London, Christopher Bennett. He is senior editor with the media group Institute for War and Peace Reporting. He's written extensively about the Balkans. Gentlemen, hour by hour, we see clear evidence that ethnic cleansing is going on as hundreds of thousands pour across the border from Kosovo. But Mr. Abrams, how confident are you of the stories of atrocities in Kosovo, that they're true?
Well, I'm quite confident. We have now 2 researchers in Albania, 1 and soon 2 researchers in Macedonia interviewing the refugees, and the stories just have an incredible amount of consistency and credibility. There's no question that an orchestrated campaign of ethnic cleansing has taken place, with looting, robbery, and documents being taken on the border, with many cases of sporadic killings. It seems intended to expedite the process of removal. We're trying to confirm the reports of mass killings, and so far we have documented 1 case, at least 40 ethnic Albanians killed in Velika Krusha, and we are getting reports of many other such cases and are trying our best to confirm them. Until we get all the facts, we are withholding absolute statements on what has fully taken place.
Fine. Mr. Bennett, what are you seeing and hearing? What momentum of evidence are you collecting yourself that convinces you that stories of atrocities are, in fact, something we have to take very seriously?
What is happening is, in essence, that there are some atrocities committed with the aim of frightening the rest of the population into fleeing. Now, it's an old pattern that took place in Croatia and most poignantly in Bosnia and Herzegovina. A few are killed in an especially brutal fashion, and then the rest leave, and they leave out of fear because they are afraid that a similar fate might await them.
Mr. Abrahams, are you getting a clear picture of who's doing those atrocities? Is it the same groups, paramilitary groups, either dressed as army or many of the familiar groups we've seen operating before?
Yes, we are. The refugees are all telling the same story. It's clearly police, special police forces, together with the army, which is something somewhat different from the past year in Kosovo. The army is clearly taking part in these activities, and there are consistent reports of paramilitaries. It's very difficult to point the finger precisely because uniforms are constantly being swapped and it's not exactly clear, but definitely those groups are all involved.
I wonder what you make of Mr. Bennett's point here that it may not necessarily be the scale of atrocity, in other words, thousands of men killed, but the selective horror of small groups very publicly killed that sets off the rush out of Kosovo.
Well, our findings match what Mr. Bennett has said. It seems to be sporadic killings meant to instill fear in the population, but there have also been credible reports of larger scale killings. I mentioned the one where we have confirmed it took place, and there are other reports very credible. And I would just add that there are many areas of Kosovo where we still don't have good information. We've confirmed that the men and women have been separated, for example, in Mališevo. We have no idea what has taken place there. Other parts of Kosovo is the same. So while we are very horrified by what we've learned, I personally am terrified by what we have not yet learned and may learn in the coming weeks.
Mr. Bennett, the familiar signs of ethnic cleansing, as I think you point out, is more than just killing. There seems to be a whole crescendo of abuse that descends upon refugees on the way to the border. Is this a standard tactic we've seen before?
Well, the profit motive is actually part of ethnic cleansing. We saw this in both Croatia and in Bosnia, and again, in essence, you expel people, you also seize their possessions, and as they are fleeing, you take whatever you can off them. This is, to a large extent, what is motivating many of these paramilitary groups. They are personally getting wealthy out of this.
Mr. Abrahams, the argument has been put forward that the bombing escalated ethnic cleansing. In fact, the evidence seems clear that it did. It's been a much greater amount. NATO counter-argues that ethnic cleansing was, however, going on before and would have continued, perhaps not a flood, but certainly a fatal trickle. Would you agree with that?
Well, it's true. There have been war crimes and crimes against humanity being committed against ethnic Albanians for the past year of this conflict. Also some against ethnic Serbs by the KLA, I would add. But there's no question that the intensity and frequency of these abuses have increased since the NATO bombing campaign. To suggest that that's not the case is, in my opinion, disingenuous.
Oh, I think they are conceding that is the case. I think the argument is that if there had not been a bombing campaign, there would still have been a longer-term ethnic cleansing that would have continued and ultimately perhaps emptied Kosovo of all Albanians anyway.
Well, it's true that these atrocities were taking place, but the systematic cleansing really wasn't. In last summer, there was terrible disruptions internally, internal displaced people. If you remember when the humanitarian crisis was called back in August, but people were not being thrown outside the borders of Kosovo to the extent that they are now.
Mr. Bennett, I suppose at a certain point you have to ask what should the world be doing from your vantage point as a human rights reporter? What do you think must be done?
The people we're talking with, who are actually writing for us, though we're not using their names at present because they're afraid of reprisals, are saying, what if NATO stops bombing? What will the repercussions of that be? And the same people who were warning in Belgrade that there would be great ethnic cleansing if NATO was to start bombing are actually now saying if NATO is to halt the bombing, then Milosevic will actually turn on the enemy within, the remaining dissidents within Serbia, and they're actually terrified there as well. So really, having been backed into a corner and having been really forced to begin a bombing campaign, poorly prepared because they were doing it essentially to save face, they actually now have to see this policy through, which means actually escalating still further, which means being prepared to also deploy ground troops within the country, and then which means to deal with the consequences at the end of the day, which has to be actually going after the entire regime.
Mr. Abrahams, can I ask you the same question? From your vantage point, seeing these stories of atrocities, what must be done? Apart from obviously helping refugees.
Of course. Well, Human Rights Watch does not take a position on the use of military force, so I'm not able to call for ground troops, but clearly that's one of the options that is being discussed. But I do believe, aside from the military options, there are a number of other things that could be done. First is tightening the economic noose around the Milosevic regime. Not sanctions that will hurt the Serbian people broadly, but to really identify where the bank accounts of the ruling elite are and figure out ways to cut off support oil and funding sources for the military. That has not been done, in my opinion. And secondly would be the War Crimes Tribunal, really pushing investigations and prosecutions. I believe if Radovan Karadzic and Mladic indicted Bosnian war criminals, if they had been arrested, that would have helped to send a message. I don't think it's too late to send that. Not that the War Crimes Tribunal is an incredible deterrent, but it can help.
Gentlemen, thanks. Thank you both very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
For two and newscast, but the one story that has been especially difficult to cover is what's happening inside Kosovo. Within hours of the first NATO strikes, Serbia expelled most Western journalists. Only a handful managed to stay behind. One of them is Antonio Russo of Italy's Radio Radicale. Mr. Russo was forced out of Pristina last Thursday. He joins us tonight from Rome. Mr. Russo, you were in a unique position. You were a foreigner in Pristina, and I gather you saw killings and you saw atrocities with your own eyes.
Yeah, I saw, what can I say, in my personal experience, when there was trust in the quarters of the Pristina, towns. My quarter was Velania, where also is Rugova's house, and it was surrounded by militian and force, special force, Vojska, and also APGs, military little tanks with
armored personnel
aircraft rifle, yes. And they used that for surround the quarters, and they start to shelling. And first they get position on front of the Rugova's house, and they stop there and they get position. After that, they going around, the quarters, and they start to push out all the people, house by house, door by doors. And in that situation, when people start to going out, I can hear, not see, because it was dangerous, but I was no more than 10 meters far from. Two soldiers get in one house that I know that was living people, old people around, I think 65, 70 years old, that they don't want to get out because they don't know where they are going. and what they do it, and they want to stay at home, and they were shot to death.
As the civilians fled from Pristina, fled Kosovo, what was the atmosphere? Was it one of sheer terror?
I can say you, the blood was really ice to us, you know, because we don't know what was going on, what is happening, what is our destiny. They only push us in a sort of river to go down on the center of the town, but we don't know the destination about that. And so all of us, you know, eyes by eyes, was questioning what is going on, because, you know, this man was so huge, and, you know, the way to act, and also by their dresses, you know, they have, you know, 5 rockets on their back, and the Kalashnikov and big guns against us, and all the time with a huge and ugly face, and they all the time say to us, and look in the face us, you know, to say raus, raus, you know, mean fast.
Mr. Russo, thanks very much for joining us. Now please stay with us. When we come back, 5,000 refugees will soon arrive in this country. The right decision, but is Canada going about it the wrong way?